Recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairwoman. I thank the panelists for being here today. Look, we've been talking and received some information of opinions on the executive power vis-a-vis legislative power, and that's a great debate to have sometime. But part of the reason and then we've conflated this into the lack of trust in the federal government, and part of the reason for that, of course, is that we have an over-bloated government that is huge with regard to the bureaucracy and the encroachments that we have in the lives of everyday Americans. And as we go through this hearing today, I'm reminded, I had to pull this up, but I reminded of some words that Frederick Hayek wrote about 65 years ago when he said, "Is there a greater tragedy imaginable than that in our endeavor consciously to shape our future in accordance with high ideals, we should in fact unwittingly produce the very opposite of what we've been striving for?" And that's what I think we may be doing today as we do as we consider this bill. It's an important bill, of course. This hearing, however, I think merely serves as yet another excuse to attack the legacy of President Donald Trump by trying to claim he was guilty of all manner of abuse of power. The legislative agenda that backgrounds this whole discussion, the so-called Protecting Our Democracy Act, was introduced by Representative Schiff right before the presidential election last year, solely to try to tip the scales in candidate Biden's favor. And we know that because the bill was never debated or marked up in any one of the 8 committees to which it was referred, including this particular committee. Speaker Pelosi stated that the Protecting Our Democracy Act was designed to address President Trump's, quote, staggering litany of abuses and ensure that they can never happen again by anyone, close quote. Now that's just partisan hyperbole. In fact, Ms. Pelosi's rhetoric would have us believe that Representative Schiff's legislation was so critical to our republic's survival that we in Congress would be totally remiss not to dedicate our full attention to it. And yet she assigned it to 8 committees that didn't even hear it. Magical thing happened. After the November election, the bill almost completely disappeared from congressional discussions. And that's a shame because there are at least a few provisions in last year's Protecting Our Democracy Act that are worth discussing and seriously debating and considering. But I hope everyone in this room will forgive me for expressing a healthy dose of cynicism, given the fact that most of Representative Schiff's bill was clearly nothing more than a messaging vehicle for partisan purposes. The reality is that IG reform will always be a challenging endeavor because the Constitution grants presidents broad staffing and firing authority, inherently. Mr. Smith, I know you're very wary of nearly all potential reforms we've been discussing today, and I certainly share your concerns. I also very much agree with your statement that many of the proposals we've been discussing deceive the public by simply giving the appearance of taking action against real or perceived problems while doing little to actually address them. Nevertheless, as an intellectual exercise, I am curious to know what specific reforms among the menu of options we've been discussing and that are in this piece of legislation do you find most and least objectionable on strictly constitutional grounds, if you were asked to place them along the spectrum? Mr. Smith.
Well, I certainly think most concerning are the for-cause removal provisions for the inspector generals. And I think an important point needs to be made here. Under the current system that's in place, if a president is deemed to have improperly removed an inspector general, he or she can certainly pay a political price in terms of if Congress views them to have acted improperly, or if the American public has viewed them to act improperly, then a political price will be paid. And then more to the point, even if the removal provision or other acts are ultimately upheld to be constitutional, we still have to ask whether they're wise policy. And we saw that if we go back to the independent counsel provisions from the Ethics in Government Act of 1978. The Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of that provision over Justice Scalia's lone dissent, but later Congress ultimately let that lapse because of unintended practical consequences that really showed that there were problems with how that functioned in practice. So I think we certainly need to be concerned about these for-cause removal provisions that could impede on the Article II power of the presidency. And then other policies, such as those relating to the Federal Advisory Committee, may not necessarily have as pronounced constitutional concerns, but again, I think it's still worth considering what the practical unintended consequences of those reforms could be.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlemen,